Hello, everyone, and welcome to this pre-recorded presentation for AGU 2021. My name is René Steinmann, and I'm a PhD student at ISTER in Grenoble, France. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the seismic signature of ground frost revealed with machine learning. So I want to start this presentation by showing you some interesting and surprising observations we made a few years ago in Hamburg, Germany. So here in the city of Hamburg, we installed these three broadband seismometers, WMO1, O2, and O3, at the measuring site, where we also have environmental sensors which measure the temperature and water content inside the ground and the temperature in the air. This whole measuring site is part of a bigger project called HUSCO, which aims at monitoring the urban soil and climate in times of global warming. So the surprising observations we made happened in the beginning of 2018. So here in blue and red, you see two temperature time series ranging from January to April 2018. And the red curve was recorded in the air, and the blue curve was recorded at 5 centimeter depth, so just beneath the surface. And we can see that during February, we had quite cold nights, but also cold days with freezing air temperature. However, the sensor at 5 centimeter depth never goes below 0 degree. So that means that if we have a layer of ground frost, it doesn't reach below 5 centimeter depth. So it's only a thin layer of ground frost we have here. So now in black, we have the seismic velocity variation retrieved from seismic cross correlations. And we can see that during February, we have in general a velocity increase with a peak at beginning of February and a larger peak at the end of February. So note that the axis here, the dV over V axis, is flipped. So we have velocity increase downward and velocity decrease upward. And so this observation shows that the surface wave velocities are very sensitive to this thin layer of ground frost. And we can use dV over V to track the freezing and thawing process on a centimeter scale. If you want to know more details about this observation, I refer to this publication we made earlier this year in Geophysical Journal International. So now, based on these results, we had the question in mind, can we use directly the continuous seismograms to gain information about the freezing and thawing process? So instead of doing the cross correlations, using directly a three-component seismogram. So how would we tackle this problem? There are many ways to answer this question. We want to use here an unsupervised learning approach and rephrase the question in, can we find a pattern which is only active during the occurrence of ground frost? And if there would be a pattern, how does it look like? So what is the seismic signature of the ground frost? These are the questions we have in mind for the coming slides. So we want to look for patterns in the seismogram. And one way to do that is to cluster windows of the seismogram. So clustering means we group seismic signals based on a certain similarity measurement. And this would mean that we then could kind of give labels to different parts in the seismogram. To do that, we need to find a good representation of the seismic data. The raw waveform data is not really useful for cluster analysis. So one representation of the data would be a Fourier-based spectrogram. However, in our case, we want to use the deep scattering spectrogram since it has very nice characteristics for classifying or clustering time series data. So how do we calculate a deep scattering spectrogram? In this case, we use a two-layer scattering network. So here's the first layer and here's the second layer. So we take a window from a single channel of our seismogram and we perform wavelet transforms and get our first layer scaleogram. Based on that, we do a second set of wavelet transforms and we get our second layer scaleogram. From here, we do temporal pooling. So we collapse the time axis of the scalograms and we get our scattering spectrum. Then we concatenate the first and second layer scattering spectrum. And we do this for the east-northern vertical component and we get our scattering spectrum vector. Then we slide this window forward and we do this again. And this way we get our deep scattering spectrogram. And the size of the sliding window here determines in the end the sampling rate of the deep scattering spectrogram. So in total, we will have a very high dimensional representation of our data, which is not very favorable for cluster analysis, since distances become a complex concept in a high dimensional data space. For that reason, we need to reduce the dimension, and we do this with an independent component analysis, an ICA, and we call the reduced data space feature space. So we kind of extract the most important features out of the high dimensional data representation. And then in this feature space, we perform hierarchical clustering and retrieve the dendrogram. So the dendrogram is the reason why we go for hierarchical clustering, because it gives a tool to explore the data and identify a pattern related to the freezing process. So what do we see in the dendrogram? Here at the bottom, we have all observations belong to their own clusters. And then based on a similarity measurement, like the Euclidean distance, these observations merge to larger clusters until all observations are unified in one big cluster. And so you can think of this as kind of a tree, where this is the trunk with all the branches going into the trunk, and here we have the leaves. So now the task is to find a cluster or a branch related to the freezing process. So, but before we do that, we just need to set a few parameters. So here the window size will be 10 minutes, since our temperature sensors also sample at a 10 minutes interval. And so note that the window size here of 10 minutes also defines the sampling rate here. So here we have every 10 minutes an observation. And this is also preserved with the dimensionality reduction. So here we also have an observation every 10 minutes. And so the last parameter we need to set is the number of dimensions in the feature space, which is 8 in this case. And so to set the number of dimensions in a feature space is an exploratory task and is a trade-off between keeping the most crucial information for the task at hand, but also keeping the dimensionality low. If you want to know more about this whole pipeline, there's a preprint on SOR, where we apply this method to a different data set. So here we have our dendrogram, which contains 3 months of continuous 3-component seismograms. And the dendrogram itself doesn't really reveal much except the splitting or merging of clusters. So to identify the cluster related to the freezing process, we need to have a look at the temporal detection curve. So when is which cluster active, and does it correlate with the occurrence of ground frost? So of course, I cannot show you every single branch we see here, but I will show you the detection curves of these 5 clusters, A, B, C, D, and E. So this is what we see here, the normalized cumulative detections over time. And here in the background, with the faint colors, you see the detection curves for A, B, D, and E. So you see they detect continuously over time. And cluster C shows no detection until February, and then has a small increase with a little pause, and then we have a larger increase at the end of February, beginning of March. And when we compare this to the air temperature, we can see that especially this large increase at the end of February correlates with this very cold period where we have freezing temperatures at day and night. And this pattern looks quite familiar. We already saw this kind of in the dV over V curve, where we had a smaller velocity increase at the beginning of February and a larger velocity increase at the end of February. So now after we identified the cluster C as the cluster containing the data during the ground frost, the question is, what is the signature of this cluster, or what is the signature in the seismic data? So to reveal the signature of cluster C, the first step would be to go from the dendrogram back into the feature space and ask me the question, where is cluster C located in the feature space? And we can answer that question by looking at the centroid of cluster C, which is kind of the average. So this we show here, it's the absolute centroid. And we know that feature 5 has quite large values compared to the other features. So that means that when cluster C is active, we have large values on feature 5. And we know from this representation here that the features have a time dimension. So we can have a look at how feature 5 evolves in time. And so this is the black curve here. And we see we have amplitude variations in February, particularly at the end of February, where we also have these cold days and nights. And also at the beginning of February, where the amplitude variation are a bit smaller. And this again resembles a bit the pattern we already saw in the DV overview. So this suggests that feature 5 tracks the process of freezing and thawing. And we have to remember, like at the beginning of the pipeline, we had the 3-component seismogram. So the freezing and thawing process is encoded in the 3-component seismogram. However, we still don't know what exactly is the signature. But what we can do is, so here the ICA, it's a linear operator. And of course, we can go from the side dimension data space down to the feature space, but we can also go back based only on these 8 features. So it's kind of a filter operation. And what we can also do is we can mute all the other features except feature 5. And those preserve the response of freezing and thawing in the deep scattering spectrogram and filter out all other signals. So this is what we will do here. So first I want to show you the original first order scattering spectrogram. So I don't want to show you the whole scattering spectrogram because it's too much data. But the first order scattering spectrogram can be interpreted as a Fourier-based spectrogram. So we have the time axis here from January to March. And then on the y-axis, we have the frequencies, which are the center frequencies of the wavelets, of the first order wavelets. And now if we look at the east, north, and vertical component, we can see we have these fringes in the between 1 and 30 hertz due to the urban imprint in the seismic data. So we have day and night, week and weekend. However, we do not see any signal related to our cold period here in February, in particular at the end of February. So now if we look at the reconstructed data based on feature 5, first of all, we see that the fringes disappeared because we muted all the other features, which means we also probably muted the urban signature. But now what we see are these amplitude decreases, especially on the horizontal components, but also a bit on the vertical component. And it's stronger for the end of February than for the beginning of February. So this is our signature. We have an amplitude decrease on all 3 components. However, it seems that it's strong on the horizontal component. So this just suggests that there's something going on with the H/V ratio. And if we look at the H/V ratio, both the original and the reconstructed H/V ratio, we see now a decrease above 10 hertz in both data sets, corresponding with this cold period at the end of February, but we also see something at the beginning of February. Okay, to sum up everything, so we retrieved the seismic signature of the centimeter thick ground frost with an interpretive unsupervised learning approach. And the signature was the decrease of energy and H/V ratio, especially in the high frequency domain. And this is in agreement with existing literature, which observed already H/V decreases, but on a larger scale, so on scales of permafrost. And what are the implications of this study? Well, I think, so we already know that seismology can be a powerful monitoring tool for permafrost, but this really shows that even a single 3-component seismometer has quite large potential, and we can leverage this potential even more with machine learning, I would say. Since the H/V is affected, this also suggests that there's something happening with the surface wave modes. And if this is the case, if surface wave modes appear or disappear due to the high velocity layer at the surface, this could make the interpretation of DV/OV measurements a bit more complex than previously thought. And the last implication would be, at what stage does ground frost actually start to influence the side effects? So these are 3 open questions for the future. I'm happy to talk about them or to talk about the methods. Yeah, here's my email address. And yeah, thanks very much for listening.